Good morning, Peter Alexander. How are you?
Good morning. I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm good as well. That's a bit of a switch. We just spent the first, what is it, 5, 10 minutes or so talking in Dutch because you are a Dutchman as well. And welcome to the show. And now all of a sudden we have to switch to English, which which can sometimes be a shock as well. Anyways, we've got you here, and I'm very happy that you're here because I bumped into you in listening to another podcast, which was a Belgian podcast. The Belgian podcast is it's called Dirty Sheets, and it's a I say a Belgian podcast which talks about well, say human intimacy, and this is a clean podcast, so we can't go too much into details on what the context was that you talked about. Nonetheless, you're here, and you've got some magnificent stories to share with us, and so I'm very looking forward to this interview. But I've heard of you. We have been in touch for some time, back and forth, and now you're on the show. Nobody knows you yet, but that's going to change because I'm going to ask you right now. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where do you come from? Where are you now? And what would you consider your cultural frame of reference? I know there's a lot of questions, so just kick it off and see where we end up with.
My name is Peter Alexander, Peter Alexander Kerkhof. I'm a research fellow at the University of Ghent in Belgium, I have learned in the past year of living in Belgium as an expat scholar that I'm probably very, very Dutch. The Netherlands is the country in which I grew up, and my cultural reference would definitely be the Netherlands.
Yes.
Living in Belgium really makes me at times even homesick. But
Okay.
I also have to appreciate all the good things that they have in Belgium here.
No doubt, no doubt, no doubt. So,
Yes.
that's something you mentioned in the before I hit record. Actually, you're not born in the Netherlands.
No. I was born in Colombia,
Uh-huh.
and I was adopted, and so I grew up in the Netherlands, actually very close to the Belgian border.
Okay. All right.
So,
Well,
yeah.
yes, and by the way you speak Dutch, I can immediately make out that you are a Dutchman and not a Belgian. And you've been living in Ghent for 1 year now.
For 1 year, yes.
1 year in Ghent, the English
This is
speaking.
my postdoc position. So
Okay.
my position after finishing my PhD dissertation.
Which is a wonderful city actually, and it's about 80 kilometers, about what is it, 60 miles west of Brussels, to give you some geographical position. It's a university town. Spent there sometime last Friday. I was there as well, as a matter of fact, in a little place called Merelbeke. Nobody knows Merelbeke, and that's not going to change. We're not going to talk about Merelbeke. Tell us a little bit about what you do at that university, because that is the link with culture.
Okay, so I'm an historical linguist, and my interest is in history and in language, and especially how language can inform us about what happened not only 100 years ago, not only 500 years ago, but even 1,000, 2,000, and especially prehistory, 6,000 years ago. So that is my main interest. And that is my training. I'm trained as a comparative Indo-European linguist. So we work with prehistoric languages. We work with the oldest languages that we know from Europe. And we try to say something both about how that language was spoken, grammatically, phonetically. But also we try to say things about the people that spoke that language, and how language can inform us about the culture that these people had, and the other way around, how culture can actually help us understand the traces of the languages that we have from that distant past.
Okay. What languages do you speak yourself? I mean, it's English and it's Dutch, but what other language would you speak?
I it's a topic that you get asked very often as a linguist.
Of course.
And many linguists don't like that question because they don't see their competency as knowing many languages. But I actually take great joy in learning languages. I actually think that with each language that you learn, your horizon gets wider.
Uh-huh.
So I learned how to read an awful lot of languages. Most of them are dead languages, I have to say.
Okay.
But the living languages, I think I can read around 10 or 12, something like that.
Wow, And what are some examples, for instance?
So, well, of course, Dutch and English, they are a given. I read French. I read French very well. I read German very well. I speak French and German also reasonably well. I read Italian. I read Spanish. I also speak both reasonably well. We have to give me a couple of weeks to get back into it because, as you know, speaking a language takes practice.
True.
But I can also read most of the Scandinavian languages, reasonably Russian. I even, back in the day, learned how to read Berber, Moroccan Berber,
which is the inhabitants of the mountains in Morocco, right, close to the desert. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, learning languages is my main joy, and I've learned how to read quite a lot of them. But if you don't maintain your languages, you will lose them. So I try to focus on the Western European languages when it goes to speaking and reading. And that's, of course, apart from my academic competences, which involve maintaining all these ancient languages from the Middle Ages.
True. I think it's an interesting concept to that extent, and it's you fulfill the typical stereotypical Dutch thing because we are known in the world as being able to speak many languages, which is not always true, but in your case, it typically is. Which brings me to another question. How come a language dies? Why is that, or does it only evolve? Or can you actually say at a certain moment a language is now it's dead? How does that work?
Well, it's an interesting question, and there are two ways to go about this. So, of course, a language can cease to be spoken, and people can choose to switch over to a completely different language.
Just like that?
Yeah, a completely different language. For example, people in the north of France, in the 6th and 7th century, so in the early Middle Ages, they spoke a very old variant of Dutch, entirely all the way up to Paris. Okay. So even some of the place names that we have from north of France, Amiens, Paris, Boulogne, from the 6th and 7th century, those place names were actually written down, in some cases in Dutch, because people were speaking Dutch there. But at a certain moment, they switched over. They switched over to speaking late Latin. And at that moment, Old Dutch in the north of France died. So when you have language shift, the language dies. So when that language is ceased to be spoken, and they switch over to a completely different language, that's when it dies.
But it's not a situation whereby people come together and say, let's have a meeting, and what are we going to do on our list is, what language shall we speak? Shall we do this or that? So what is in general the driving force for this to happen?
That's actually a very understandable one. It's an economic one, and it has to do with prestige. It has to do with parents thinking, what is for my children the most beneficial language to speak. So that's the reason why a lot of people don't raise their children in dialect in the Netherlands, in England, because they think that learning the standard language holds the most prestige. So that's also what happens, for example, when people in France, from speaking Old Dutch, switched over to speaking late Latin. Those parents thought, well, speaking Latin is more prestigious. They will get further in life. They will have more economic benefits if they learn from us how to speak this language. And they don't. When parents choose to raise their children in a specific language, that is actually the mechanism of how language shift goes into action.
Something which you can clearly see nowadays back again, and in Belgium as well, because a lot of people, French-speaking people in the language border in Belgium as such, send their children to Dutch-speaking schools because the parents think that indeed economical chances for their children are better if they actually are either bilingual or at least speak a very high level of Dutch. Which is, and then we're talking 2017, of course, and you're going back to the early Middle Ages.
I went back way further, but this was one part of the story. So this is language death through language shift.
Yes.
And the other one is language death through language evolution.
All right.
Which also goes very, very close to what you referred to.
Yes.
And there the situation is a lot murkier, because we have to define at what moment a language ceases to exist, even though its speakers continue to speak something which derived from the older version.
Yes. So what's an example of an evolved language like that?
Well, for example, the main example in this regard is always the case of Latin.
Yeah.
Because the Romance languages, languages like Spanish, Italian, French, Romanian, Retro-Romance, they are one family. It's really clear to see that they're all related. Okay,
Yes.
you take the word for father, padre, pater, etc. You can see it. You can see it very clearly. And Romance is very special because we have a modern language family, but we also have something that comes really, really close to its origin because we have attested Latin from the classical times, and that more or less is kind of the source of all the other Romance languages. Not exactly, it gets pretty technical, but it can serve for all practical purposes as well. This was the mother language. This mother language split up in specific ways. So the question is, so when did Latin split up? When did people think, well, we're not speaking Latin anymore? This is a big discussion in historical linguistics and a big discussion also in medieval studies, in history. And there are different ways to go about it. You could say, well, a language Latin died at the moment that the speakers themselves made a difference between what they spoke and the Latin in the church, because Latin was still spoken in the church.
Yeah.
And that would be what we call a meta-linguistic criterion. So we let the speech community themselves make the distinction between the languages. When they say we speak a different language, they speak a different language.
Right.
But this is also linguistically, this is not a very reliable one.
No.
Because people can say that they speak different languages while they actually don't. Like,
it's as if fuzzy. It's a fuzzy distinction. In a
very
way.
fuzzy.
Yeah.
And, well, you can also see how these kind of splits can be reinforced. Like in the 19th century, most Serbians and Croats, they would be really convinced that they spoke the same language. But yeah, and linguistically, we speak of one language. We speak of Serbo-Croatian.
Yeah.
But I think for a lot of Serbians and Croats nowadays, to say that they speak the same language would be very insulting.
Yeah.
So letting the speech community themselves decide what the borders are between languages and what language they speak is historically and linguistically not often the most reliable measure to go about it. So ideally, we would like to have at least some kind of interaction between the two.
Yeah.
So we could say, well, this is the moment, for example, that people started talking in the early Middle Ages in the north of France as their language as Française, as French.
Okay.
Because that was the moment when they said, well, we don't speak Latin anymore. Now we speak Française, we speak French.
Okay.
But on the other hand, how far back can you pull that? Can you push the birth of French? Yeah. And there, linguists can say, well, grammatically, already in the 8th century, in the 7th century, we see these linguistic elements of French which are different from Latin. So try to make at least a combination of the two. So that is more or less my answer to your question. So languages die and languages evolve. And I would say they are two different things. There are languages that die because the speakers switch to another language.
Right. And
there are languages that evolve. And then the language continues to be spoken, but evolves on and on and on. At a specific moment, people actually make for themselves a distinction. They say, well, now we call it a different language.
Yeah. So I understand that. I understand that difference, and yeah, fair enough. The next question that pops up, but it's a bit of a. I wonder if you can do something with this question. What is the link between language and culture? Is it one and the same, or what comes first, language or culture, or does the culture steer the language? How people use language as such?
This is also a very, very controversial topic.
I'm sorry about that.
For a long time. And don't worry about that. It's actually a topic that I feel very passionate about because
cool. Yeah.
I would say, and I think many modern day people would say that the language that they speak is a big part of their identity, of their cultural self-identification.
Yes.
And I also know as an expat working in Belgium that the fact that they speak the same language but quite differently works very alienating because my language forms as a self-identity marker,
Yeah.
and for the Belgians as well. They hear that I'm not Belgian.
Yes.
So the question is, how specific is this a modern phenomenon? So is this something that is really linked to what we call the invention of nation states from the 18th and 19th century, where these governments in 18th and 19th century Europe really said, well, we are the Germans and we speak the German language, and the German language is part of our German culture. How much is this an invented idea? Or is this really something that is common to all language identity nexuses? And I would say that the language identity nexus, so that's the technical term for that, the link between language and identity and whether they hang together, I would say that this is old. I would say that also for someone 6,000 years ago on the plains of Crimea, where they spoke a very, very distant ancestor of our language, also they would have ideas about how the language reflects to their cultural self-identification. And on the one hand, of course, language reflects part of your culture. The concepts that you have, they will be reflected in the language that you use.
Yes.
And specific languages can make specific choices. Some languages use words for concepts that do not exist in other cultures. So in that regard, this nexus, language and identities, for historical linguists, very important because we can use it. We can use the words that we have in ancient languages to hypothesize about the culture that must be connected to it. And I think a lot of historians, the last 30, 40 years, have been way too strict in saying, well, identity is dynamic. And we know that identity is dynamic. You can even change your self-identification. Like you can say, well, from this moment, I feel so culturally acclimatized to being this, that, and everyone recognizes me with my new self-identification. So, yes, culture can be cultural self-identification can be dynamic, but language is something that is very hard to shake. An accent is something that is very hard to shake.
Oh, sure.
From my English, like I have an American accent, but there are also elements of my accent in my English that are definitely Dutch.
Yes.
And I could try to hide that, but it would make for a more unpleasant conversation for me because I would really have to.
Yeah, and it's not you. Yes.
Well, it's for everyone. Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. So I would. That is the point that I'm making, is that the language uses as an external and as an internal identity marker. And that reinforces, of course, the link between culture and language.
Yeah.
And this is how it is today. And people feel very passionate about that link. People say, well, I'm Spanish and I'm from Spain and I speak Spanish. And when I speak English, I can't express myself in my own cultural reference frame because I need to speak Spanish to do that. But I also think that this was the case in the Middle Ages, like 1,000 years ago. And I'm very, very positive that this was also the case 2,000 years ago, or maybe 6,000 years ago.
So to that extent, it's culture and language in a way is like frozen history.
Definitely.
It hasn't changed. It doesn't change, and then again towards the future, it won't change either.
The language identity nexus, this link that language is a big part of identity. I think this has been a common element in human history. Definitely.
Okay, so if we move on, because I wanted to go towards a topic that you announced before we hit record, which is called migration. As such, I want to move towards that, but I want to take a step in between. You're a historical linguist and philologist, if I get that correct. Old Germanic, Old Romance, and Old Celtic languages. Now, these are from my perspective, that's a language barrier or border that you can draw, but you can also draw a very cultural border with that in terms of the Roman Empire, Catholicism as such. What's your take on that? Do you agree? Is it like that? Do you have some interesting background or stories about that?
Well, it's once again, very interesting question. Thank you very much. The language border, for example, between Romance and Germanic, the one that runs through Belgium, almost horizontally, which is very fascinating, of course, as a historical linguistic fact, has also been discussed for at least 150 years of academic research. People have said, so how much is this the product of modern developments, at least developments from the 16th century onwards, and how further back into the Middle Ages can we push the presence of this language border?
Right.
I would actually say that Belgium itself is a nice example of how culture can change quite dramatically in the course of 200 years, because a large part of Belgium is Dutch speaking, and it has been Dutch speaking for the last for at least the last 1500 years, but a lot of the let me rephrase that. A lot of the cultural differences between the Netherlands and Belgium, they are not at the language border. They are at the Rijksgrens. They are at the border between the Netherlands and Belgium.
Yes.
And they show that the linguistic border in this regard does not coincide with the cultural border.
True.
So of course, there is also what we call an isogloss between the Dutch-speaking area, cultural isogloss between the Dutch-speaking area and the French-speaking area. So of course there is a cultural border there, and how to what extent these borders have reinforced each other, or how old they are. This is controversial, and I think it's very hard to say things about this. And you probably also know that historians and economists have also hypothesized about this. For example, what do we do with the history of wealth and the difference between it? Max Weber with Catholicism and Protestantism. Was this the thing that reinforced these differences back in the 16th century? It's possible. And as you are hinting at yourself, there's also the presence of the former Roman border. And linguistically, this is a very, very, very relevant border. Also in the Dutch-speaking area, because it kind of it's the border between Southern Dutch and Northern Dutch, and there are a lot of traces of what we call Latin influence that really stop at the rivers in the Netherlands.
Yeah, so let's just paint a little bit of a geographical picture for those of you, the audience that is not familiar with the geography here.
Yes.
We're talking about the Netherlands and Belgium in terms of two countries, and the Belgium is above France, and the Netherlands is above Belgium again. And the Belgium is the country where they speak two languages. One is Dutch, and one is French. And in the Netherlands, the Dutch speak Dutch, of course. And indeed, at the time, I always say Julius Caesar, he went north from Rome and conquered, that time the Roman Empire, and then probably turned around because in the south of the Netherlands, because of the weather was too bad, and he said, I've had enough, I'm going south, back home again. And that's indeed what you see. If you look at, for instance, Catholic churches, Roman Catholic churches, you can see them changing in shape, being very opulent in the south of the Netherlands and in Belgium, to being very modest modest is, I guess, the word. If you look at more Protestant churches, which you can see also in Germany and in the rest of the Netherlands, being Julius Caesar calling the Germans barbarians. So that's sort of the geographical picture that we're talking about. And now I'm giving it back to you, Peter Alexander.
Yeah, and of course the difference between the architectural styles is that's a trace of the 17th century.
That's later, yes.
Of first Protestantism and Catholicism going apart, and later Belgians having the Baroque culture and the Netherlands, being Calvinist, they didn't.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the historical extent of this cultural border, I think it's really, really hard to say. And I think we are dealing with reinforcing aspects of specific elements of language and culture. And we know, for example, that when it comes to Belgium, Belgium was not really the area of a language border in the Middle Ages. It was more like a frontier zone.
Right.
A zone where people have been bilingual for almost 1,000 years. And you still see that nowadays in Belgium. Like a lot of Flemish, a lot of the Dutch in Belgium is sprinkled with French words. That's very normal for them. They don't even think about it.
No, true.
And that has been for a long time the case. And this is in a sense what we see nowadays and what we see from the 18th, 19th century onwards, where you really have the idea of the nation state, is that we're dealing with a difficult picture for Belgium because they're kind of stuck in this historical process. They were a frontier region between two cultures, between two languages, and instead of going with one or going with the other, the nation state, well, we do state, it's not a nation state, the state kind of froze on this specific frontier area. And this is, of course, the same that we find in Switzerland. Switzerland is also a nice example of how we're actually dealing with different cultural and linguistic borders. Yep. So I would say the linguistic border is old and tells us a lot about history. The cultural border, in some extent, might have been associated with it, but probably not to the same extent as we see nowadays. Because what we see nowadays, of course, has also been very, very much influenced by the last 150 years.
Yes.
Things can change dramatically through the politics of just a generation. And definitely in the politics of the last six generations.
Yeah, very much. Would you agree? Just curious to what you say to this question. I always state that the Dutch-speaking Belgians are Dutch-speaking Latinos. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. I would definitely, yeah. I don't know. Isn't there like this proverb that says the south of Europe starts below the rivers in the Netherlands?
Yeah, something like that could be, yeah.
I once heard that. But I think there is definitely something to it. They really, there is this cultural border, and the Belgians, I think that they also would say themselves that they share more cultural aspects with the French and with south of Europe, but that's more your area of expertise.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the Belgians, well, this basically comes to the phenomenon of if somebody says, doesn't matter which culture they're from, if somebody from the United States says, I'm not typical American, these people are typical American. If somebody says, I am not typically Belgian, I am more Dutch, then you cannot get any more Belgian than that. Anybody who states that he's not typically what he actually is, he exemplifies exactly what he is. So, but if you go back to the form and the shape, the 2,000 years ago, say Julius Caesar, up until 17th century, up until now, there must have been a lot of people moving around, and that's the topic of migration. And that's a revival that we see currently at this moment again. What parallels can you draw between what happened then and what's currently going on right now, which we are trying to get to grips with, really?
I think, and thank you once again. These questions, they really speak to my big obsessions, my academic obsessions. So
it's my pleasure.
I'm happy with this question. So I would say there are two things to take away from these.
Yeah.
And one is that the effects of migration can be very long-lasting. Actually, of course, what we see nowadays with the nations and the states of Europe, this is just a result of migrations that largely happened at the end of Roman times. This is the moment when the proto-states, the early medieval first kingdoms that later grew out to the states that we have in the 16th, 17th century, when they were founded. So I think it's important not to trivialize the effects of migration. They can be very long-lasting, and I think that's a good thing, because culture grows whenever it comes into contact with another culture.
Yes.
And that is what migration does. Migration brings other cultures and other languages into contact with each other. And actually, on the linguistic level and a historical level, the most fascinating case is France.
Okay.
So when you take the Romance languages, the languages like Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Romanian, etc., you might notice that Italian and Spanish, they have a lot more in common than they have in common with French, especially in the sound.
Yes.
French sound very different from Italian and Spanish.
Yeah.
And it also sounds different from Romanian, also sounds different from Portuguese. And historical linguists would argue that this is not a coincidence. Because when you see where the border is between what we call the original area of the French language, which is not entire France, because in the south, another language used to be spoken, which we call Provençal, Provençal. So, or historically, that's not French. So when we look at the border where originally French was spoken, that is exactly the historical border where the Franks came. And the Franks were the historical people that at the end of Roman times broke into the Roman Empire when they conquered large parts of the Roman Empire. And in the north of Gaul, the Franks, they made their kingdom. And they said, well, this used to be called Gaul, but now we don't call it Gaul anymore. We call it the Kingdom of the Franks. Okay. This is, of course, why we call it France nowadays, because that's what it means. And exactly the political border of the 6th century is the border of the language between French and Provençal. And Provençal, if you've ever heard someone speak from the south of France in their dialect and not in French, you can even hear a little bit in the dialect of their French, it also sounds more like Italian and Spanish. Okay. And the sound, the difference lies there at this old migratory border, this border from 1500 years ago. And this is what happened. So the Franks, who were speaking Germanic, who were speaking kind of Old Dutch, very old version of Dutch, they invaded Gaul, and they made their kingdom. And they spoke Old Frankish. And at a certain moment, we talked about this before, they switched to Latin. Right. Yeah. But they couldn't shake their Dutch accent. Okay. This Dutch accent is actually what made the French language. This Dutch accent is what makes French so different to listen to than, for example, Italian and Spanish.
Do you dare to say that to French as well? Because these guys are so proud. You're going to get like a beating. Okay.
And I think a lot of French linguistic professors, they don't like this story, but they know it's true.
Okay. I'm going to ask my father-in-law, because he's a francophone and he's a French teacher. So I'm going to confront him with this. All right. So the Dutch actually shapes the French language in terms of their pronunciation and the fact that it sounds so different from these Italian, Spanish tonalities. Yeah.
And this border actually that runs through France, the border is actually at the River Loire. You know, the River Loire is also a border of cultural significance. There's a big difference between the north of France, as you probably know, and the south of France. And historically, this was also the border between different kind of law systems in the Middle Ages. And it was the border between different ways of working the soil, of agriculture, and a border between different ways of roofing your house. And you still can see that. Like when you come in northern France, you see that the old houses are completely different than when you're in the south of France. So once again, here you see that the effects of a migration that took 1500 years ago actually formed a marker that in later times might have reinforced growing dynamic identities. But the border was still there.
Is there, from your historical background, and we're living in the 20th, 21st century, is there anything, or any parallel that you can draw, or any prediction that you can say, that, I mean, in the coming generations, like this happened then, and history tends to repeat itself time and again, and we don't learn really fast. So what's going to happen with this influx and the migration that's currently going on in Europe? What effects will we see in 1, 2, 3, 4 generations from now?
I think of course, that there have been a lot of effects in the last 30 years, and this is what makes some people really, really scared about what they then call indigenous identity.
Yes.
And we can deny that our culture is changing. And all the context, the new context that we have, they change and influence our culture. And on linguistic level, I also feel very confident in saying that the different accents that immigrant speech brings, they will also change our languages.
Yeah.
So immigrant Dutch will definitely, in a couple of generations, leave its traces on the Dutch language.
Yes.
And in some cases, it even has. We have adopted some words that were that were not natively Dutch, but that are commonly used.
Yeah, this typical examples are what the local language or dialect, if you want, that the Amsterdam people use, and there are some Yiddish or Jewish or Hebrew words incorporated there. Yeah.
And now we don't even feel them as immigrant words anymore.
No, they're ours as well.
They're ours. Yeah, even the name for the city of Amsterdam, Mokum.
Yeah.
It's as Yiddish as it can be. Even the Hebrew word is exactly the same word for city. So this shows us that this does not need to be a problem.
No.
Like the language can be influenced and the language can change. And just as long as people have the idea from, okay, this is all ours, and it doesn't reinforce segregation, it doesn't reinforce our mental device that we have, and that's of course where it gets difficult. As long as we see lines through society and say, well, these people belong and these people don't belong. For me, at least, it gets scary. And
that's the in-group, out-group thinking, which doesn't really help. Yes.
So
all right.
Culture. Well, how will it change in the future? Who knows? But it will definitely change a lot. I think cooking will change. I think maybe even cultural elements as how we deal with conflict situations. Just given enough time, in 2, 3, 4 generations, might really change based on what people are used to in North Africa, or people used to in the Caribbean. They influence our culture.
Yes, and by the time we're there, in terms of time, we won't even notice that they came from there in terms of other parts.
Been internalized.
Yes,
definitely.
They are ours as well. Yes,
and to very quickly go back to the history of France again.
Yeah,
I think that's a prime example of what happens. The French nowadays, they don't even highlight this migration history elements anymore, just in schools. This is not part of what they think is important for their history. So of course they learn about the end of the Roman Empire. Of course they learn about the Franks, but they won't say, well, we are Franks.
No.
And we used to speak Dutch. No, they don't.
No.
This is a part of history that's being glossed over.
Yeah.
And whether that's a good or a bad thing, well, you can differ in opinion about that.
That's beside the point. It is what it is, really. Yeah.
It shows that history is only the product of how we reinvent the past, of what elements we actually say, well, this is important. This is what makes us whole, and this is what divides us.
Say that again. I like that quote. History is.
I'm not really sure how I worded it.
History is only a way to how we shape the. I don't know. I'm going to listen back to what we recorded here because I really like that quote. That's an excellent quote. All right. It's. I need to look. I'm looking at the time here. We're on 39 minutes recording, and generally the topics or the interviews are about 30 minutes. But I am fascinated by your topic, and because it's so closely related to what I do in my daily life. I'd like to go towards the end and ask you 2 final questions. One is the question that I prepped you for, and the other question is how to get in touch with you. But first, let's get to that question. Can you give us a tip or 3 tips or a couple of tips on how to become more culturally competent?
Well, the first one would be, and it comes very close to the quote that I gave you.
Okay.
Is that history is the product of our invented past, of the things that we choose to highlight, of what elements make us whole and what elements divide us. And this living history, sometimes they say, well, living history only goes back 3 generations. You only really can connect and care about the things that happened to your grandparents. And the further back, if you go back further than that, you're actually in this invented past.
Yes.
It's an area of legend forming about what happened. And I'm not saying that all our history from the 18th and 19th century is legend forming. No, of course we have our historical sciences which try to reconstruct really what happened. But how we choose to make those things relevant in society, of course, is a product of what we highlight and what we don't. And in that regard, I would say, well, it's just really, really important that we remember that the past is relevant to what we have nowadays in society, way, way further than just 3 generations, 6 generations, 12 generations, 40 generations. They are just the products of all those different decisions, of all those different individuals who made decisions about who is prestigious, who do I belong to, who do I identify with, who is the other. And I think if we realize that, if we realize this significance, the significance that these identity choices are dynamic, that people have moved around for ages, that migrant histories, like the one of the birth of French culture and French language, can be forgotten. Well, can be forgotten, can at least not be relevant to ideas of identity nowadays in France.
Yes.
I think that can really help us, because it makes us aware of choosing to unite instead of choosing to segregate.
Yeah, that's one giant tip, which encompasses, I think, a lot. History is the product of our invented past. I like that. I'm going to elaborate on that in the show notes that you can find back in culturematters.com, and then go to the podcast tab if you want to listen to this interview and, of course, the more interviews as well. Professor Dr. Peter Alexander Kerkhof, which means cemetery as well.
Yes.
How can people get in touch with you? If they
I'm
want
not
to?
a professor. So.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so Dr. Kerkhof, how can people get in touch with you if they want to?
You can reach me on my university email, which is peter.kerkhof@ugent.be. And I think that's the easiest way to get into contact with me.
Yes, so it's Peter, Peter.Kerkhof @ugent.be.
Yes.
That should be it. All right, I'll put that in the show notes as well for those of you who are listening in the car or mowing their lawn at this particular moment. You never know what people do. Peter Alexander, thank you so much for elaborating on this. I knew this was going to be good, and it's one of the longer, we're almost 45 minutes, one of those longer topics that I'm fascinated about. So I'm very happy that you came on board, and I'm pretty sure that we'll talk to each other in the future.
Thank you very much for your interest.
Thank you. Bye-bye.